Maria, a single mother, moved into a house in San Pedro, California in the early 2000s. At first, the house appeared normal, but she began noticing subtle signs of paranormal activity shortly after she and her children moved in. It started small, flickering lights, strange sounds, and a pervasive feeling of unease. These occurrences weren't alarming at first, but they did leave Maria with a sense of being watched. Often she would hear creaks and groans from the house late at night, noises that didn't seem to have any logical explanation. This unease only intensified as time passed, and soon Maria became more attuned to the odd occurrences that seemed to take place mostly at night. Her children were the first to report feeling as though someone was watching them, but they couldn't explain why. This vague sense of dread settled in, and despite Maria's rational mindset, the fear was palpable. Sometimes, Maria thought the creaks and bumps were just typical house-settling noises. However, when the sounds continued and intensified, the fear began to grow. It was clear that something in the house wasn't right, but what would follow would make the early signs seem like nothing compared to what was to come. One night, after her children had gone to bed, Maria noticed something strange in her peripheral vision. She was sitting in the living room when, from the corner of her eye, she saw a tall, dark figure standing in the hallway near her children's bedroom. The figure was not a person, but a shadow, dark and distinct, though it lacked any real features. Maria froze, unsure of what to make of it. She immediately felt a rush of fear, as if something was wrong, but the figure quickly vanished before her eyes. She chalked it up to her imagination, but the feeling of unease persisted. The next day, Maria again saw something similar, but this time, the shadow was more defined and clearer. It seemed to be lurking in the doorway of her children's room. The figure didn't move, but the sense of terror it caused was immediate and overwhelming. The shadow didn't resemble a human form, yet it stood upright and tall, casting a dark presence in the doorway. It was at this moment that Maria began to feel something sinister was happening in the house. The idea of a shadow figure wasn't completely foreign to her. She had heard stories of shadow people, entities known for their dark human-like forms that are often seen in peripheral vision. These beings are believed by many to be malevolent or even demonic in nature, and Maria's experience seemed to match the description she had heard about them. Still, she was hesitant to jump to any conclusions, and dismissed the encounter as a mere trick of the light. But the feeling that something was deeply wrong in the house was now undeniable. As the days went by, the activity in the house escalated. Maria's children, too young to fully understand the situation, began reporting experiences that mirrored their mother's. They claimed to see a figure standing in their room at night, watching them as they tried to sleep. The descriptions from her children matched Maria's experiences, the tall, dark figure that appeared like a shadow with no features to identify it. The kids spoke of it with a mix of confusion and fear, unable to explain why the presence terrified them so much. It soon became apparent that the shadow figure was drawn to her children. They were the primary targets of its eerie presence. In addition to the sightings, Maria's children began experiencing other strange events. They complained of strange noises outside their doors at night, doors creaking open without anyone touching them, and a feeling of being physically touched, though no one was around. This only intensified the growing sense of dread within the household. Maria, trying to rationalize the situation, spoke to her children, but they seemed genuinely frightened by what they were experiencing. The youngest would often wake up in the middle of the night crying, describing a man standing by her bed. This behavior was out of the ordinary for them, and Maria began to realize that something far more disturbing than mere imagination was at work. The house felt increasingly unwelcoming, and her attempts to make sense of the situation led to more questions. As time went on, Maria herself began to experience more direct encounters with the shadow figure. Late one evening, she saw the dark silhouette again in the hallway. This time, she could hear faint whispers and heavy breathing emanating from the figure, which terrified her more than the previous encounters. Unlike before, where the figure seemed to vanish when she approached, this time it stood still, staring at her with a presence that was almost palpable. Maria felt paralyzed with fear, as if the shadow had the power to immobilize her. She could feel the air in the house grow cold, and the oppressive atmosphere made it hard to breathe. It was as if the figure was feeding off her fear. For several moments, Maria couldn't move, locked in a kind of fearful trance, watching the figure from the corner of her eye. The figure didn't just vanish this time. Instead, it slowly faded into the darkness of the hallway as though it was retreating. Maria, shaken and unsure of what to do, retreated to her bedroom, clutching her children to her. The more she reflected on these incidents, the more she became convinced that this was not just a fleeting, isolated incident. Something malevolent was haunting her home, and it had a dark, supernatural presence. As the Shadow Man's appearances became more frequent, Maria and her children began to experience sleep paralysis, a phenomenon where one is temporarily unable to move or speak while waking from sleep. In these episodes, Maria would wake up in the middle of the night, unable to move, and find herself feeling an intense weight on her chest, as though something heavy was pressing down on her. She would often hear the whispers of the Shadow Man, which seemed to surround her in the darkness. The sleep paralysis episodes were not limited to Maria alone. Her children also began experiencing the terrifying phenomenon. They would wake up, frozen in place, unable to scream or call out for their mother, as the Shadow Man loomed over them. The sensation of being watched, suffocated, and paralyzed grew worse as the days went on. Maria began to research sleep paralysis, hoping to find a rational explanation for what was happening. But the more she learned, the more she realized that the presence they were experiencing was not something easily explained away. Sleep paralysis is often accompanied by feelings of dread, a sense of a dark presence in the room, and the sensation of being watched. All of these things lined up with Maria's growing fears about the Shadow Man, leading her to believe that something darker than just sleep paralysis was at play. After several weeks of terrifying experiences, Maria decided to contact Paranormal investigators to help uncover the truth about the Shadow Man haunting her family. She hoped that experts might be able to explain the phenomena, or better yet, put an end to it. The idea of bringing strangers into her home was daunting, but at this point she felt desperate for answers. The investigators arrived with all of their equipment: cameras, EVP, electronic voice phenomenon, recorders, and electromagnetic field detectors. They immediately set to work, asking questions about the family's experiences and conducting a series of investigations in the house. As the night went on, the investigators noted strange temperature fluctuations, unexplainable sounds, and cold spots in certain areas of the house. At times it felt as if the very walls were alive with energy. During one of the investigations, an EVP recorder captured an eerie voice that sounded like a whisper, but was impossible to decipher. The investigators were spooked by the results, but they needed more evidence. They decided to stay the night, hoping for a more direct encounter with the entity that had been tormenting Maria's family. What followed would only add to the mystery. On one of the nights when the paranormal investigators were present, they managed to capture footage of something that left them stunned. The footage showed a dark figure moving across the wall in one of the bedrooms. While it was not fully visible, the shadow appeared to be human-shaped, though it lacked any distinguishable features. It was the exact same shadow figure that Maria and her children had described, but this time, the presence seemed to be, along with the visual evidence, The investigators also captured strange sounds on their audio equipment. They recorded low growls, whispers, and what sounded like scratching noises, emanating from different parts of the house. The investigators were unable to explain where these sounds were coming from, as no one in the house had made them. It became evident that the activity in the home was more than just an isolated incident. This evidence further convinced Maria that something beyond the ordinary was happening in her home. The footage and audio were unlike anything she had ever experienced before. The Shadow Man was not simply a figment of her imagination. It was real, and it was active. As Maria continued her search for answers, she came across the possibility that the haunting could be connected to witchcraft. Some paranormal experts suggested that the Shadow Man might be a manifestation of a curse or spell cast by someone with malicious intent. Maria didn't know of anyone who would have had a reason to curse her family, but the more she looked into it, the more she found that previous tenants of the house had reported strange occurrences as well. This led her to suspect that the house itself might be cursed, or that there was some dark force lingering within it. Maria did some research into the area's history and discovered that the land on which her house was built had been home to a number of tragedies over the years, including murders and unexplained deaths. Could these past events have left a lingering, vengeful spirit behind? Or was it something more dark and ancient that had found its way into her home? As weeks passed, the Shadow Man's behavior became increasingly aggressive. Maria and her children were no longer simply seeing it, they were now being physically attacked. Maria's youngest child began waking up with bruises on her arms and legs, as though someone had been grabbing her during the night. The child would often cry out, saying that the Shadow Man had touched her. Maria herself was not immune to the Shadow's wrath. One night she felt cold fingers wrap around her wrist while she was lying in bed. She tried to scream but found herself frozen in place, paralyzed once again by the malevolent presence. The air grew thick, and she felt as though something was draining her energy, feeding off her fear. The more she tried to resist, the stronger the sensation became. It was as though the Shadow Man thrived on her terror. Over time, the physical manifestations of the haunting became more disturbing. Objects in the house would move on their own, even when no one was around. One day, a vase fell off a shelf, but there was no indication that it had been touched. Similarly, furniture would shift slightly, and doors would open or close by themselves. The family tried to lock doors at night, but by morning, they would find them wide open. One particularly unsettling event involved Maria's kitchen. She came downstairs one morning to find all the chairs stacked neatly in a corner, as if someone had arranged them while she was asleep. There was no explanation for how the chairs had been moved or stacked. It felt as if an unseen force had been using the house, rearranging things at will. After months of terrifying encounters, Maria finally reached a breaking point. She could no longer endure the torment, and neither could her children. The Shadow Man had become more than just a presence, it had become an active threat. Maria knew she had to leave. She packed up her family and moved out of the house, leaving behind the oppressive, dark energy that had taken hold. Even after they left, Maria and her children would sometimes have nightmares about the Shadow Man. They could still feel his presence in their minds, even if they were no longer in the house. The haunting had taken a toll on their mental and emotional well-being, and the relief of leaving the house was tempered by the lingering trauma of their experiences. Maria wasn't the only one who had experienced paranormal activity in the house. Other tenants who moved in after her reported similar encounters with a shadowy figure, leading many to believe that the house was indeed cursed. Some tenants spoke of hearing footsteps in empty rooms, while others claimed to see the same Shadow Man standing in doorways at night. The common thread among all the stories was the sense of being watched and the oppressive, suffocating atmosphere that hung over the house. It seemed as though the Shadow Man had made it his domain, tormenting anyone who dared to live there. The fact that multiple families had reported similar experiences suggested that whatever entity haunted the home was not easily appeased. Before leaving, Maria consulted with spiritualists and paranormal experts who offered different solutions to rid the house of the Shadow Man. Some suggested a cleansing ritual, where they would burn sage and use holy water to purify the space. Others recommended a more intense exorcism. However, every attempt seemed futile. The Shadow Man always returned, more powerful and more menacing than before. Despite all the attempts, nothing seemed to work. The inability to rid the house of the shadow figure led Maria to believe that this entity was not something that could be easily banished. She started to wonder if it had been there long before her family moved in, perhaps tied to the land or to an event that had occurred centuries ago. Even after Maria left, the story of the Shadow Man persisted. Local folklore surrounding the house grew and more people learned of the haunting. Some believed that the figure was a ghost while others thought it was a demon. The exact nature of the Shadow Man remained unclear, but his terrifying presence became a part of local legend. Some residents even claimed to have seen the figure in other parts of San Pedro, suggesting that the Shadow Man had expanded his territory beyond the house. The Shadow Man's true identity remains a mystery. Whether he was a vengeful spirit, a demon, or something else entirely is unknown. Many theories have been proposed over the years, but none have provided definitive answers. The house in San Pedro remains a chilling reminder of the terror that one family experienced, and the Shadow Man continues to haunt the memories of those who lived through the ordeal. Some believe that the entity still resides in the house, waiting for the next victim to cross its threshold. Others suggest that it may have found a new place to haunt. Regardless, the mystery of the Shadow Man endures, leaving questions that may never be answered.